mistakes on mistakes on mistakes. Can we say that, is that true, that Christianity is based on this kind of mistake? What we're going to do this evening is answer the question that was posed a few weeks ago. Is Christianity based on Chinese whispers? Is it based on what might be called a myth, although that's not the correct way to use that word. A myth is a story from ancient times. So of course Christianity is a myth, but people tend to use that word in a negative sense, that it's untrue. Is it based on something that was kind of like a rumour that was spread, was then picked up and passed one to the other, and that mistakes were kind of gathered up? You know the old story about in the First World War, they said, they sent the message back, was it send reinforcements, we're going to advance. And by the time it got back to the commanders, it was send 2 and 6, we're going to a dance. Because that's what happens when you pass messages on and you're doing it in a stressful environment. But people make mistakes and then make mistakes on mistakes on mistakes. Can we say that, is that true, that Christianity is based on this kind of mistake? That something went wrong, but it had been passed on and others believed what had been passed on. And it's a perfectly reasonable question. Because we are talking about a land that is 2,000 miles away from here. We're talking about a culture that bears no resemblance to the culture that we're in, and a quite remarkable story. It is Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, believes that Jesus is God with us. What we're celebrating at Christmas is the coming of God amongst us, God with us. God will be born just as we were born, but he will save us. Nobody else has this kind of basis to its faith, but that's what we believe. And of course, during Advent, we're also looking forward to the second coming, because we believe that Jesus will come again. The work is not yet finished. Somebody once said Christianity is like between D-Day and VE Day. D-Day when we landed in mainland Europe in 1940. Thank you, 4. Really, that was a very major moment when we were back onto mainland Europe. But the war was not over. And the second coming is like VE Day. And of course, we're looking, ironically, from a different place. And so we know it's going to happen, and we know we're in the victory, but we're still waiting for that victory to happen. And so all this stuff is quite remarkable. And is it just based on whispers that have gone around? And is it true? When it comes to your ability to remember story and retell story, to remember events and retell them, you are not very good at it. In actual fact, you have now lost, most of us, have lost the ability to remember telephone numbers. When I was a lad, which is beginning to feel longer and longer ago, I could not only remember my own telephone number, I could remember all of my friends' telephone numbers and all my family's telephone numbers. With the advent of the mobile phone, I no longer need to do that. And I can't even remember my own telephone number because the brain adjusts. And the brain decides that we don't need that gift of memory anymore, and so we'll use this brain space for something else. And it's the same with the oral tradition. We no longer need to remember story in the way that people once did. I was watching a program the other evening, very interesting program, on Homer's Atlantis, or the myth of Atlantis, the sunken city, the city that was advanced society that crashed into the sea and was lost and was then found by Jules Verne's and his submarine and all that kind of stuff. Is it actually based on fact? And what this scholar was saying was actually she believed that it was based on a story that had been passed down from generation to generation about a real city that was indeed advanced in the way in which the shared wealth amongst them was very equal, the way in which they governed themselves and did business. And that there was a massive, what they now understand to be a massive volcano went off, and with the tsunami and the earthquake that went with that, this city fell completely into the sea and was buried, or the rest of it was buried under 40 meters of ash. I mean, it made the recent eruptions look small. They've excavated down so they can see exactly how much ash there is and the pyroclastic clouds and all that worked out. And what this other scholar who she interviewed about this, he said that we underestimate wildly how accurate the ancient world was in telling very accurately from one generation to the next accounts of historical events. And so this event, this earthquake and eruption and tsunami that enveloped this region, this area, was indeed told. And Homer, the writer about Atlantis, had heard this. And so he then took that story and made it into a moral story about getting too full of yourself, that pride becomes before a fall, which is what Atlantis is all about. But they believe that actually that story is really true. And so the idea of it being passed from one generation to the other is a bit like, I think, our ability now to remember telephone numbers. Once I could do it with great ease. I could tell you my uncle's telephone numbers, my auntie's. I could tell you my friends, including the code, everything. But I can no longer do it because I no longer need to do it. And so the idea of something being passed from one generation to the other, we must not base our thinking on our ability to do it, because we weren't the ones who were doing it. This next part is based on one of the Alpha talks when we look at, is the Bible true? Because I want to remind you of why I believe we can be very confident that it is. What we're looking at when we're looking at the New Testament is an ancient document. It is no question about that. It's 2,000 years old and written in a language that is no longer spoken. And there is a science, believe it or not, in how you deal with ancient documents. And one of the techniques is a thing called textual criticism. And what you want to know is you want to be able to compare one book with another book. So if you've got, say, Gospels of John, you want to be able to compare as many of them as you can to see how similar they are. You're looking for similarities. And the more you have, the better off you are. Okay, I want you to bear that in mind. The more documents you have, so take this is John's Gospel. If you've only got one, you've got nothing to compare it to. If you've got 20, then you can compare the other 19 to this one to see if there are any errors in the writing of it, any changes that might have been made later on to make things look different or better. And that's what you're doing. And this thing called textual criticism. Now, there are a lot of these documents around, so we're going to look at some of the ones that very briefly go through a list here of some of the old ancient documents and when they were written and when the first one that we have. So Herodotus, he wrote in 488 to 428 BC, so that's 500 odd years before Jesus. The earliest copy we have is 900 years after Jesus. All those early ones have been lost. They were like the ones, I don't know, did you have Jack and Jill books? Did you have Jack and Jill? Yeah? I bet you a mint copy of Jack and Jill, which I was given when I was 4, is now worth a fortune. I bet it is. Mint condition, I bet it's worth a fortune. Do you know why it's worth a fortune? Because we all threw ours away. When we could read, we tossed it in the bin. The clever people who hung on to them, now they're worth a bomb. Well, that's what happened to Herodotus. His stuff just kind of got lost. And so we don't have any early copies. All we have is something that is 1,300 years after the original was written. Okay, and we have 8 copies of that very earliest one. Then there's this other guy, whose name I can't say, but you can see who he is. Similar kind of thing, another 900 years, and we've only got 8 copies of his. Tacitus, he wrote 100 years after Jesus, but the earliest copy we have for his is not until another 1,000 years. And we have 20 copies to compare. So we've got more to compare when it comes to him. Caesar's Gallic Wars. This is Caesar's account of how he got on dealing with the French, really, and bits probably of us. When he came up into the kind of Europe, and he fought these heathens that lived up in Europe. And this is an account of how it went. Now, he did that 50 odd years before Jesus was born. And then, obviously, when he came back to Rome, he was then made Caesar because it all went terribly well. The earliest account of that we have is another 900 years. So 950 years later, and we have 10 of them. We can compare 10 of them. Livy wrote a history of the Roman Empire. He did that around the time of Jesus, but we have 20 copies of that, and for another 900, that's 900 years for the earliest copy. Can you see the kind of distance in time that we're looking at and the amount that we have? Nobody doubts that what you have when you read Caesar's Gallic Wars is what Caesar wrote. Everybody is quite happy about that, even though we only have 20 copies and there's some 900 years between the earliest one we have and the original. We still say that is a reliable text of what he wrote. We'll come back to a second about what he wrote, but they go, that is reasonable. Now look at the New Testament. We have 5,000 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 in Latin, 9,300 in other languages, and it's quoted 36,000 times. So what that is somebody else, so I write to Justin, well, it's very appropriate, isn't it? Because Rex and Justin, we write to each other, we're two Romans, and I say to you, I read something about a guy that Paul wrote, and he wrote this: all things were created for Jesus and by Jesus. Can you believe such a thing? Love, Rex, kiss, because he's a good friend. That letter he kept, because obviously I'm a valued friend, he kept it, passed it down, and I've got that quote from Colossians, which I can know when it's dated because I put the date on the top, and we can check, well, is that close to what we had before? And so they're quoted elsewhere. We have the earliest full manuscript is 350 years. See how much shorter distance that is from the other. When it comes to the pieces, I think John's the oldest, is only about 30 years between the earliest copy and what you can read if you go to Manchester University. I've got just about New Testament Greek. If I went and looked at that manuscript, which was written 30 years after the events in which it records, I could read what it says. And I can check it with what I've got in here under John. When it comes to looking at ancient prose, which is what this is called, technically that's what it is, ancient story, ancient prose, it's almost like, be careful, the ink is still wet. The man who wrote it may even have still been alive to say, that's not what I wrote. We are talking about breathtakingly early. And we have thousands that we can compare to one to the other. If you were to take my New Testament Greek New Testament off my shelf, you would need to dust it. It hasn't been down for a while, I confess. But at the footnotes of my Greek New Testament, it tells me which manuscript they've used in the bit that they've taken out. So it will tell me it's manuscript 423 from Golders Green. So that I, if I want to, can check whether what they've put in there is accurate. It's all quite cross-checkable, and it's all out in the open. The man who put this together was a man called F.F. Bruce. I don't know that he's still alive now, but he was a professor in Manchester. And he's using evidence quoting Sir Frederick Kenyon, who was the leading scholar in this area, and he said this: the interval between the dates of the original composition and the earliest extent of evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. So what he's saying is that really what you have, there's so many copies that are so early, you might as well say in this context you have the original. There's no point in even saying, oh well, it's 30 years after the event. Not when you're talking about 2,000 years. And the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both in authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. To say, are these Chinese whispers that are recorded in here, in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, Acts and in Paul's letters and the book and the other letters and Revelation, are they just Chinese whispers in when it comes to scholarship in ancient text is a ridiculous statement. for the sheer extent of copies we have and how old they are, that is no longer a question by anybody that's scholars. If anybody says to you it's Chinese whispers, then I think you can quite confidently say, no, it isn't. It's based on what was written by the people who witnessed those events and by the people who worked out how then are we church. And so what you have in your hand, you can be confident is what they wrote. Now let's go back to Caesar's Gallic Wars, because this is quite relevant, really. Caesar was writing a propaganda document. Caesar looks amazing. In Caesar's Gallic Wars, there's one hero. Guess who it is? Go on, have a stab in the dark. It's Caesar. He looks great. He has campaigns. He wins everything. He fights a battle and doesn't even get muddy. You know, he's just amazing. He is clearly the best leader the world has ever seen. And his book bigs him up. And so, when we look at Caesar's Gallic Wars, we go, well, that's what he wrote, but it is a load of rubbish. Yeah, okay, it tells us the campaign, it tells us where he went, but it doesn't really tell us how those battles went. And we know that because of the way in which it's written. Because Caesar just looks too good. There's no way that you have a campaign, a Roman campaign, all went so swimmingly well without any soldiers getting dirty. War is a messy business. There are advances and retreats. There are victories for both sides. You get it wrong. Your tactics are wrong. You have to rethink them. And so we know by what is written in it that it's unlikely to be a very accurate record of what actually happened. It tells us where he went, but it doesn't really tell us how those battles went. So bear that in mind, and now think about the New Testament. Mark's Gospel is considered to be based on Peter, by the way in which we know that the who was with who, when and where. We're pretty certain that who Mark is, and we're pretty certain where he got his material from, was from Peter. Does Peter look like Caesar? Does he look like a hero? Does he when he says, who do people say I am? Peter says, you're the Messiah. Now, he's looking good at that point, isn't he? Because he's got it, yeah? And he doesn't get that knowledge, said Jesus, from humankind. You got that from God. You've been praying properly and paying attention, and you've heard the voice of God. It's going really well. Then what happens? He ends up being told off in front of everybody else for getting it completely wrong. Judas betrays Jesus once. How many times does Peter manage it? 3 times. Peter does not look good, does he? We love him, but he kind of bumbles along. He's kind of enthusiastic, but his enthusiasm doesn't have enough knowledge with it to make it. He's quite dangerous, really, isn't he? He doesn't look good. In actual fact, I have to say, Jesus doesn't look terribly good either. When you look at the Gospels, Jesus started a worldwide mission. Did you notice where he started it? On an inland lake. That is not a great place to start a world mission. You want to be on a port, really, by the sea, so you can take your message out somewhere else. Okay? At maximum, he has around about 120 followers. How many are at his foot of his cross? 6 max. The rest will run away scared. I mean, he's rude. He really will not take disciples who really don't want to be his disciples. Some say, can I go and bury my dad? He goes, no, let the dead bury the dead. It's a big issue. It's a big issue in Jewish culture to look after your parents. Actually, it's a commandment. Yeah, he says, no. Let the dead bury the dead. You come look after me. You know, can I go and make me bed? No, come and find. And some of them go, this is just too hard for us. We're going to walk away. What he says to those who want to follow him is, do you know what it's going to be like? You're going to have to pick up your cross every day. And if that wasn't bad enough, don't worry, because people are going to hate you. Actually, not just people, your brothers and your sisters, your mum and your dad, they're going to betray you and hand you over. But don't worry, because they did it to me first. So it's okay. Anybody else in here slightly nervous about that? Does it sound... Is this idea of being a Christian look cosy and nice? Come with me, follow me. You'll be considered a hero. You will look great, and it will all go swimmingly well, because I'm Jesus. No. It says exactly the opposite. Jesus does not hide how difficult it will be to be a follower of him. All of these things are evidence that what they wrote down is actually what happened. If you were going to make it up, you'd make it up a lot different to what we have. If you're going to make Jesus look great and the disciples look great, you're going to make them look a lot different to what they actually are. What they look like is human. They look like me and you. Jesus is very clear about how mission will work. People are not going to like it. John says in the beginning of his gospel, people like darkness. They don't like the light. They don't want to come into the light. They want to hang on to what they know. This won't be easy. And so the way in which the main characters are portrayed is evidence that is not made up. If you're going to make it up, it's going to look a lot different to what it does. Whoops. Now, let's have a look at this bit. Matthew 14. If you've got a Bible with you, can you turn to Matthew 14? And could I have a volunteer to come?
And he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people, because they considered him a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted, and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus.
I think what I'm now going to explain to you, we've looked at this before, this is a study of the names used in the New Testament. I think this is quite instinctive. This is not at all planned. What's going on is Matthew is using the name John in two quite distinctly and different ways. One to people who know who he's talking about, and one to people who don't. So, it had John is not. It was a bit like today, I guess. If you give the command, "Bring me the head of Rex," the chances are there are only going to be one of us, and so he'll get the right head, mine, on a platter. John, however, is quite a popular name, and if he said, "Go and get me the head of John," they might well have brought him a dozen or so heads, because they weren't sure which John they were talking about. So listen again. At that time, Herod, the tetrarch, heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist." Very clear who he is? John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are working him. Now that was John speaking. So he's talking to his people around him. That's recorded speech. That is John. Well, which one's he talking about? It doesn't make any confusion. It's John the Baptist. Back to the narrator speaking. Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison. Why is he not John the Baptist? Why does he not say he arrested John the Baptist now? Because the narrator knows, you know, full well which John he's talking about. There's no longer recorded speech. It is actually the narrator talking to us. And you'll find that again and again and again. Jesus is Joshua. It means the same thing. It's really popular. If they say, "Is it Jesus?" they go, "Well, it could be. There are 15 of them. Which one are you talking about? Jesus of Nazareth." Ah, that one. If you want to nail it down even more, Jesus of Nazareth, the carpenter's son. Now bring it down again and again and again. This, I think, is quite instinctive. If you want to talk about somebody who others don't know, you will add information to it. You will say, "Oh, Rex, the guy with curly hair who lives in Golders Green." To anybody in this room, all you need to do is say, I saw Rex. And they will all know exactly who you're talking about. It's quite instinctive. And I could spend the rest of the evening going through other examples where there is what I call hidden knowledge. When Jesus takes a deaf man away from the crowd. Speaking to my friend who is deaf, he'll tell you that crowds are very confusing things. I didn't know that. I'm not deaf. Nor was Jesus. Nor was the people recording this. But Jesus did know and took him to one side. It's a fact that means nothing unless it's actually real. I think it's one of the accounts, I think it's Mark's account of the feeding of the 5,000. He'll tell you something only an eyewitness would tell you. The grass was green. Strange thing to comment on, isn't it? But it obviously struck him. You know, have you ever not been out and you go, wow, the flowers on the heath are looking amazing? You don't tend to say that if it's just a repeated story. That's what you call an eyewitness account of what's going on. And this happens again and again and again. These documents have been pored over for 2,000 years. They have been cut apart, restitched together. They've been looked at in every possible angle you can for weakness and for irregularity and untruth. And they still stand firm as they ever have. What we have in here, I am under the conviction, is what they wrote. How people respond to that is another matter. But what we have is what they said. What you do with the Jesus that is recorded in here, that cuts no punches, tells you exactly how it's going to be, that's entirely up to you. But what you can't say, I don't believe, is this is just an error that's been passed down from generation to generation. If that were the case, we'd have found out a long time ago. Part of the London 2020, the mission the Diocese of London puts together, says that we will become more confident in spreading the gospel. We'll be creative and we'll be compassionate of the other two. We'll be compassionate to people around us and we'll be creative. That we're going to put Tony on YouTube as one of our church wardens, and that's because we're using modern technology to advance the gospel. But I think we can be confident that what we have is actually what was written down. It's not Chinese whispers. Have you got any questions or observations on that? I'm preparing currently a sermon series on the history of the church, where we're going to see how the church evolves. And what you have in these early centuries, the first 2 or 3 centuries, is in the first 3 centuries, they're so busy trying to not get killed, really, and get the message out, that it's fairly loose around the edges as to quite what everybody believes. Some of these, because, you know, if you were going to write this, you'd have written it a lot better. You know, if Paul had realised he was writing the Bible, he'd have been a lot more careful and clear about what... There are points where it's not... Peter says, you know, Paul's letters are so difficult to understand, and they are. And so it's allowed for confusion. And this then was sorted out in about 300. So I don't know if any of you have said the Nicene Creed. We believe in one God, Father of all, creator of heaven and earth, things seen and unseen. That's a response to heresy. That's a response to people who said, well, Jesus wasn't really God all the time. He was created later for this job and all that kind of stuff. And the church sorted all that out. In Egypt, there were a group of people who thought that they had got, this was going to sound terribly familiar, they thought they'd got special knowledge. They knew the code to get through the gate. And so they're known as knowledge. The Greek word for that is gnostic. And so what they're called is Gnostics. And they come from around 200 or 300 years after the life of Jesus. And they're a group of people who decided that they knew the secret knowledge. And they didn't like these accounts very well because it seemed to be giving it all away. So they wrote their own. And the Gospel of Thomas is one of them. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene is another one. And what they do is they tell us an awful lot about that community, about what they believed and how they acted. It doesn't, sadly, tell us very much about the life of Jesus, because we know where it comes from and we know what they believed and we know what their angle was in writing it. It's a bit like Caesar. We can doubt it because we know he wanted to be Caesar, and so he needed to look good. And boy, he looks good. And these guys, they do the same. So they tell it. We know where it's written, and we know when it's written. We know it's 200 or 300 years was written rather than just a few years, and we can tell from what it says as to what angle they were at. So they're late documents, and they're not based on the life of Jesus. They're based on what they believed, and so they make the story fit what they believe.